Hi, I'm Kelly Taylor, and today I'm going to talk about the international reactions to the Impressionist movement, a period that was roughly between 1890 and 1930, very roughly. But first, I want to preface with something that's been on my mind these past few weeks as I've studied the history of modern art. History is messy. It's not as linear or neat as we humans, pattern seeking creatures that we are, often make it out to be. We enjoy stories, and oftentimes the story of our history is bent to the outline of a good tall tale. A case in point for this is the fact that John Singer Sargent was actively painting until 1925. He had nothing to do with the Expressionists. But like his Expressionists, his work was influenced by Impressionism. But for him, it was in a way that enhanced the realism of his work rather than to abstract it. There were many other working artists during the timeline of our studies all over the world, working in many different mediums and many different styles. For further context, the term graphic design was a new term coined in 1922 by a guy with a name that's fun to say, William Addison Dwiggins, for a new form of work that had come about as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Basically, businesses suddenly had a need to advertise their work. And artists could find work creating visuals for those advertisements. This is relevant because, as base as an artist working for a living might sound, adding money to the artistic industry had an effect on the business of art. Artists had done paid work before this period, but most of the clients were either religions or governments. Some of the artists we will learn about in this video were graphic designers who influenced other graphic designers, and the work they did led directly to our current visual world. Specifically, Bauhaus is coming soon, which will lead to modernism, and most corporate logos today are modernist graphic design. The Impressionists responded to the scientific and cultural advances of their time. Isaac Newton had made some remarkable discoveries about the nature of light in 1704, and by the 1860s, the Impressionists had begun experimenting with broken color on their canvases. By separating the components of a color on a canvas, a viewer could stand back and allow the colors to recombine in their own eyes. This gave the paintings a vitality that had not been seen before. The earliest reactions to Impressionism were Art Nouveau and Expressionism. Hector Guimard was a French architect who worked in Art Nouveau, and Antoni Gaudi did the same in Spain. Klimt and Egon Schiele were part of the Vienna secession, with Schiele's style being something that could be defined as expressionist, as opposed to Art Nouveau. At the same time in Belgium, James Ensor was also pushing the boundaries of artistic style with his work, as was Edvard Munch in Norway, and later in Paris, and then finally Berlin, where his work had the most influence, as we will see. The main group of expressionists were the Fauvists in France and Die Bruck and Der Blaureiter in Germany. First, we'll talk about what these groups had in common. The subject became less important than the style of the images. They all approached color as a means of expressing inner feelings, and with the hope of evoking those feelings in the viewer. They didn't attempt to replicate the broken color experiments of their predecessors. Instead, they painted colors that felt right to them, in mostly flat planes with little or no modeling. Where Impressionists had responded to the Industrial Revolution by going back to nature, the Expressionists reacted to it with a retreat to the fantasy of primitivism. Now, looking back with modern eyes, these fantasies were often reductionist, patronistic, and racist. There's no way to change the past, but we can learn from studying history that we might also have views that would be shocking to people 100 years from now, and try to think about what those views are so we can change ourselves for the better. This kind of forward thinking might also help us all to improve and advance our own artistic movements. The Fauvists formed in France in 1904, and only lasted until 1908 before the members of the small group diverged into their own idiosyncratic styles. They were so called because a critic at an early exhibition described them as, quote, wild beasts. Animalism or domesticity aside, I will just say they were a loose-knit group of French artists. Henri Matisse, André Derain, and also Maurice de Vlaminck were the wild beasts in question. Matisse wanted his paintings to give people a feeling of sitting in a comfortable chair. He wouldn't have lasted long as an artist if at least some people didn't get the intended results from his work, but there were certain people who reacted harshly to what they saw. The critics did not want to sit in the comfy chair. Die Brücke, or The Bridge in English, was a group that formed in Germany in the summer of 1905. These architectural students were coming up in very different circumstances than their French counterparts. Germany was suffering under the social, cultural, and economic conditions that would lead to the Great War, and those pressures made a mark on the work of the people trying to build the bridge. Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, Erich Heikel, Karl Schmidt-Rottluff, and Fritz Bleyl could feel the mounting strain on their fellow Germans, and that translated into their work. Another German group, Der Blaue Reiter, was formed in 1911, the same year the Mona Lisa was stolen from the Louvre. Coincidence? Yes. They lasted until 1914, 1 year after the Mona Lisa was recovered. Also a coincidence, but they do pile up, don't they? They, the Blue Rider, were named after a common theme in Kandinsky's work. Inspired by Monet and Richard Wagner, Kandinsky decided to dedicate his life to art in his 30s. He wanted to pursue the abstraction of art and related that abstraction to music with no vocals. His painting, The Blue Rider, was a result of those inspirations. The rider can be looked at as being St. George slaying the dragon of materialism. Kandinsky, like many artists, had high expectations for his paintings. He wanted to express spirituality with color and line. It's up to the individual to determine whether he reached that goal. What he certainly accomplished in the attempt to touch a higher level of spirituality with his work was a sublime abstraction. Perhaps he hoped that by not representing anything worldly, he could reach something in his viewers that also was not of this world. The Cubists, Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque, were deeply influenced by Fauvists. When Paul Cézanne died, Braque traveled to his home to paint the landscapes that his hero had so often painted. Braque emulated Cézanne's style, but took the philosophy behind it further. Cézanne liked to push perspective beyond reality, like his paintings were being viewed from two different angles at the same time. Braque took this lesson back to his friend Pablo Picasso. Together, between 1908 and 1912, they came up with a style we know of as Cubism. First, they painted in analytic Cubism, a style that took Cézanne's perspective play to its natural conclusion. Analytic Cubism took a Tralfamadorian approach to art, endeavoring to show all angles of an object at once. They rejected the bright Fauvist colors and went further than that movement ever had in eliminating the sense of depth seen in older styles of art. They later walked back from this extreme with synthetic cubism, so called because they synthesized their subjects from many different pieces. Where analytic cubism had stripped perspective down and displayed its clockwork parts all at once, synthetic cubism attempted to build more recognizable images from those bits and pieces. The Cubists made a loud noise with their work, one that is still being heard around the world. The first to hear were the Futurists. These lot were steeped in the pre-World War I culture of 1909 Italy, a country on the brink of fascism and war. They were all in for both. The Futurists were about progress, machines, and dynamic speed. The vorticists, Percy Wyndham Lewis, called it, quote, fuss and hysterics in 1915, a year after the Great War had started. They wanted to tear down the museums and start fresh with new ideas, new culture, and new art. Italy has long been known for the artistic accomplishments of the ancient civilizations that formed there. This must have bothered the young futurists as much as a modern musician might be irritated by radio stations that only play the classics. How do you get heard when everyone is already preoccupied by the work of long dead artists? So the futurists got loud. They wrote manifestos. The first and probably most important, written by Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, was printed on the front page of the Parisian newspaper Le Figaro. They paid attention to what was happening around them and got in front of that movement. Unfortunately for them, that movement happened to be fascism, which wouldn't go well for many of them. Filippo Marinetti said, quote, "We believe that the common contempt for everything young, new, and palpitating with life is unjust and criminal." He was sort of punk rock. They called for the libraries and museums to be torn down. They used materials that wouldn't last, so their own art wouldn't end up like the art in the museums. In 1930, Umberto Boccioni made his sculpture Unique Forms of Continuity in Space out of plaster, so future artists could destroy it. In 1950, long after he had died, that plaster sculpture was cast in bronze, and most of the futurist work is today in museums. There was a period in Russia from after the Russian Revolution of 1917 to about 1920 when Stalin took power and the USSR was formed, when the mood of the nation was free and truly revolutionary. They had just thrown off their old government, and they were a nation in search of an identity. Constructivism was one of the possibilities put forth by Vladimir Tatlin. Inspired to create sculpture in new ways, Tatlin and other constructivists made forms from unconventional materials in ways that both respected and took advantage of the characteristics of those materials. Traditional sculpture was very much based in solidity and mass. It respected the center of the sculpture itself. Think of the way a block of marble is chiseled down from the outside, or the way wax is built up to make a form for lost wax casting. It was revolutionary to open up the center of a sculpture the way the constructivists did. Tatlin was later forced to give up abstraction in order to continue to serve his homeland. Art history is also world history, and how a nation treats its artists can shine a light on the character of that nation. It was Kazimir Malevich's misfortune to be born a Russian, but as a patriotic Russian, he would not leave the country despite massive political unrest. His government thanked him for his loyalty by eventually declaring socialist realism as the only style of art that was acceptable in the new regime, leaving Malevich's more avant-garde suprematism out in the cold. They later fired him from his job as the director of the Institute of Artistic Culture and finally imprisoned him for 2 months, where he was interrogated about his art. The next time you doubt the importance of the arts, remember that story. Someone should write a play about those interrogations. It could be a very interesting exploration of the philosophy and history of art and repressive governments. His artistic career was defined by his work to strip art of representation. The style he arrived at after engaging first with Impressionism, then Neo-Impressionism, Cubism, and finally Futurism was suprematism, so called for, in his words, the supremacy of pure feeling in creative art. It was mostly black shapes on a white field. The most radical and emblematic piece he did in this style was just a black square on a white field. He, like his fellow Russian Kandinsky, quote, had a conviction that his discoveries were spiritual visions rooted in the traditions of old Russia.